My name is Rudolph Bailey. Actually, I grew up being called David. So anyone who knows me in St. Vincent will know me as David Bailey. But my legal name is Rudolph Bailey. Actually, there is a story behind that, and I think it will illustrate the issues when we look at records in St. Vincent. When my mother went to get my birth certificate, when I was to go to England, about 16, 17 years of age, she was told that my name was Rudolph Bailey, and that's what was in the record. Now, she registered me as Randolph Bailey, Randolph Nathaniel Bailey, and she was surprised. Anyway, they gave me a birth certificate that said Rudolph Bailey. Now, when I went back some years afterwards, around 2014 maybe, to get a passport, they said, there is no Rudolph Bailey in this file. Your name is Randolph Bailey. So I had to go and swear before the Attorney General that my name, I will not use Randolph again and will use Rudolph, because all my degrees were in Rudolph. My passport, my Canadian passport was Rudolph. My British passport was Rudolph. Everything was Rudolph. And so I had to swear that I will not use Randolph again. I never used Randolph in the first place. I went through elementary school being called David. And so my school leaving certificates say David. So that illustrates the kind of issues we find when we look in records for ancestry. Names are changed, names are corrupted, all kinds of issues.
Okay.
However, my legal name is Rudolph Nathaniel Bailey.
Okay.
I have a PhD in educational psychology, was a school psychologist, practicing school psychologist in Alberta, Canada, for about 22 years. And then I've been teaching school psychology to PhDs, to EDS and PhD students for the last 25 years, maybe. So I have 10 siblings. There are 11 of us, 8 boys, 3 girls. And most of them are in England. My family moved to England. My dad moved to England in 1955 when West Indians, lots of West Indians were going to England after the war. And my mom moved to England in 63 and I moved in 66.
So you were part of the Windrush generation?
Yes, that's for sure.
Okay.
And most of my siblings live in England. I have one who lives in Florida, Winston Bailey, and Vibert Bailey, who lives in St. Vincent, and one sister who lives in Spain, Merle, was Halder back in St. Vincent, and the others live in England. There is Harton, Mikey, Charles, Stevie, Ricky, Molly, and Corinne. Now, Corinne was murdered back in 2004, I think, in London. And the 2 brothers died. Stevie Ricky died of a heart attack, and so did Charles. So there are 8 of us living, 3 dead. All the older siblings were teachers or principals or worked in the education system. And the others were business people, social worker, that kind of thing. Okay. So we come from a variety of occupations.
Okay.
And backgrounds.
What about your parents?
My mom was, when she was a seamstress in St. Vincent. When she went to England, she worked in an electronics factory as a 4-person. You know, she checked people's work to make sure that it was correct. And my dad was a motor mechanic. He serviced diesel trucks for a milk company in Luton.
Okay.
And my mom then moved from Luton to Orpington, and then she moved to Brighton, and now she lives in a senior citizen home in London, Forest Gate, London.
Okay.
So she's still alive. She's going to be 93 on
93.
September 15th. My dad died when he was 51, heart attack in England. And that's about it in terms of my
Okay.
siblings and my parents.
Okay. Tell me about your children.
I have two children, one boy. He's a psychology professor here at Andrews University in Barron Springs, Michigan. And he teaches undergraduate psychology and research. He has a wife and two children. One child is 8 and one is 12. They're both girls. My daughter lives in Canada. She just moved from Alberta, where she was born, to Toronto. She is a librarian in OCAD, Ontario College for Art and Design. Both my children has doctorates. Carl has a PhD and Kyron has an ED. And so they're at the top of their professions.
Okay. Let's look a bit at your aunts and uncles, those relatives. Do you recall any of the names, or from your research, you can tell me some of their names?
There are lots of them. In fact, only one of them is alive. Israel Bailey lives in Honnesville. He's the only of my uncles and my dad's siblings that's alive. The others are dead. The names are Nathaniel, Vincent, Errol, Sam, Alcina, lots of names, Cecil. There were 12 kids.
And these are all from the
family.
Bailey side.
Yeah, that's the Bailey side.
Okay.
My mother has two sisters. One is married to Lawson Sutherland, who just died a few days ago. Her name was Rita. And she also had one called, we called her Dudu, but she was, what was her name? Can't even remember her name now.
Okay.
Anyway, she has the present Governor General in St. Vincent is one of her granddaughters.
Okay.
So
Okay.
we're related to her. She's my, let's see, my mom and her grandmother were sisters. So she's my, second cousin?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
What else can I tell you? Anyway, this family is huge. All the Baileys married Sutherlands, and all the Sutherland boys married Bailey girls. So there are lots and lots of uncles and aunts on that kind of.
So the main
great
connection here
uncles.
is the Sutherlands and the Baileys.
Yes, yes.
Tell me
Yeah.
about your grandparents. What do you know about them? And the rest of the extended family related to your grandparents that you're aware of.
My grandparents were, my grandmother was Adeline Samuel. Her name was, everybody knew her as Lulu. My grandfather was, on my mother's side, was William Latchman. He was first he was a principal, one of the first Indian head teachers in St. Vincent. and he went to Aruba without permission. So when he came back, they made him a sanitary inspector. So the older people in St. Vincent will know him. He rode a horse and had a gun. And when he walked into town, everybody cleaned up their toilets. So he's my grandfather on my mother's side. On my father's side, the Baileys were well known in Georgetown. My grandfather, Alfred Hubert was his name, but he was called Alfred. I think Alfred was his second name. He lived in Georgetown, had a shop. They were farmers, really. They have, coming out of indentureship, they bought little parcels of land. And when you look in the records, you will find that they had dog license and home license and that kind of stuff back to the 1880s. Anyway, when they came out of indentureship, they took the £10 and invested it in small plots of land, basically.
Okay.
So that's the Bailey side. But there's a huge Bailey family. I've been trying to enter all of that into the records, and it's taken me like weeks to enter the Bailey family.
Okay. What about some of the Indian names that you heard about growing up, maybe from your grandparents, or some of the Indian originated surnames or first names?
Well, I knew my great-grandmother, Isabella Sutherland. Her name was Isabella Laborde before she married Sutherland. She came from India as a child, and I used to pass her house every day, but never asked her anything about her ancestry. When I was growing up, ancestry wasn't really important. There was a movement when I spoke to my uncle who died just a few weeks ago. He was 103 years old, going on 104. When I asked him what his mother's name, Indian name was, he didn't know. And he says, who cares? He wanted to get as far away from the Indian culture as he could. And I think that was generally what happened in my family. They wanted to be Vincentians, basically. And so they never talked about their Indian heritage. My interest came because really there's a big movement, and has been for many years, a big movement towards roots. You remember the program Roots of African American. And so we started to think about our roots then. And so that's where my interest came from. I found almost all the Indian names for my ancestors.
Okay.
And one of them I still have to verify. I've found the names, but I have to verify. I try to verify these names from at least 2 or 3 sources.
Okay.
And I've published some of that on the original Indian Heritage site, that Bailey was bowler. I think he came on the Empress Eugenie. And when he re-indentured in 1874, he listed his name as Bailey, Bhalie. And so it must have been an official name, because he is the only person that had a name that was different on the ship's list for when they re-indentured in 1874. So that must have been his official name for him to re-indenture as that name.
Okay.
So that name really sounded like Bailey. And when his first son was born, he was listed as Bailey, Ballie. When his second son was born, he was listed as Bailey, Bailey. So it's kind of a evolution of
Right.
names.
And that's how Bailey became the one that moved forward across most of the families.
That's right. Yes.
Okay.
And so anyway, the other Indian name I know, of course, is Aku, which you've seen a lot of people have listed Aku as their forefather, because Aku's kids became Phils, Batiste, Moores, Sutherlands, and his daughters married two brothers, Setaram and Gangaram, who became Woods and Kings. So I'm related to all those people.
Okay.
You know, all those names I just named
Families.
is in my family tree.
And those are
So
relatively big families as well.
yes, huge families.
The Woods, especially.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about where your foreparents resided. Was it Georgetown? I know I've spoken to some who mostly said that Argyle, Calder was where most of their grandparents settled, but is it that your foreparents were mostly from the Georgetown region?
My foreparents were from Rabuka
Rabaca.
and Lot 14. Those were the two biggest estates in indentureship during that time. Argyle was a smaller estate, but after the eruption in 1902, the Sutherlands moved to Argyle. So Argyle became a refuge, if you wish. But my mother's side, they moved to Park Hill after the eruption. My great grandparents were killed in the Sufferin, 1902.
Okay. Incidentally, my family is from Park Hill as well, so
Yeah,
maybe connected to your mother's family who also moved there.
probably.
Because I
All
do
the
have relatives
Indians,
who are Sutherlands.
yeah, all the Indians in St. Vincent are connected.
Yeah.
In 1915, there were maybe 350 East Indians in St. Vincent. And out of that, in the 50s and 60s, there were about 6,000 East Indians. And all of those, if you go far enough back, we're all related. And some of us are closer related than others. When I first started to publish these things, people were mad at me because they found out that first cousins had married. But it was forbidden for Indians to marry people of African descent back in the old days. And so you find that they married each other, basically. My mother and my father were second cousins, and they didn't know it. So, it's when you, as an Indian growing up, they used to call all older folks either auntie or uncle. I mean, that was in the Indian tradition that came from India. And so you would call somebody uncle, and you're not sure if that person is an uncle or an auntie. And so my mom called my father's grandmother auntie, but she didn't realize that she was an actual auntie. So that's how these things went.
Okay.
And some of them knew they were cousins. I mean,
Okay.
that's just a fact. And we got to face the facts, whether we like it or not.
Right.
So basically, I know the Lachman original name. He didn't change his name very much. He was Lachram and became Lachman. And his wife's name was Sonoa. And she never changed her name. She died Sonoa in 1935. The Bailey's wife was Barangini, but she went as Branji and never changed that name.
Okay.
But her husband changed his name from Balie, however you want to pronounce that, to Benjamin. So his name was Benjamin Bailey. And my great-grandfather was Henry. And he married Catherine Herbert. She came from India as a little child with her mother. It was just her mother and her. And her mother married Herbert. So that's how she got the name Catherine Herbert. But
Okay.
she was from Calcutta.
Okay. What do you remember most about the earlier times? Maybe family-wise, religion, dress, some of the things you used growing up?
Oh, there was no Indian traditions in my family, except, of course, rice and curry. We ate, when I was growing up, the people of African descent called me Coolie, and Coolie rice and saffron is what they referred to, and you probably heard that. Coolie Karaila rice and saffron was how they described us, because we ate a lot of Karaila and used a lot of saffron, I guess.
And in this
And
case, the
so,
saffron is what we turmeric. What we
yes,
know
it's
is turmeric.
turmeric.
Yes.
Yes. But if you grow turmeric in St. Vincent, it's generally regarded
Yeah,
as
it's called
saffron.
saffron. Correct.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. So anyway, that's how I remember anything from my culture. Now, I did hear my parents talk about, Jaina Hindustani, saying, "Are you from Hindustan?" But that's about all the language, the Hindi that I heard my parents say.
Okay.
And that came down from the older generation. But I know that before the Sofre, there was an actual Indian temple in Rabuka. And all the people from within 2 miles, of course, came to that Indian temple.
And that was destroyed by the eruptions?
Yes, it was in a cave in Rabuka.
Mm.
But the fact is that they weren't allowed to go more than 2 miles without being called vagabonds and being taken to court. And so everyone within 2 miles, and Lot 14, Orange Hill, all of those places, Rabuka, they're all within 2 miles, basically. They were separate estates originally owned by the same person, but after a while, they were sold off to different people.
Okay. And that's an interesting piece you shared, and I'm sure that would strike a nerve with some folks wanted to know where exactly that cave was located. If it is still there today, maybe
No,
it was
destroyed
was
by the
destroyed.
volcano.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'm sure someone may dig deeper into that. But tell me a bit about, how things have changed then compared to now for you. How has life changed for
For
you?
me, I left St. Vincent when I was a teenager and went to school in England, mostly in England, partly in America. And so, I basically, when my dad went to England, we were kind of well off in terms of we had a wall house with running water and that kind of stuff. But when I was born, we had a board house on my grandfather's, right beside my grandfather's house. And we were farmers. So when things were good, we had money. When they were not so good, we didn't have any money. As farmers go, my dad was a carpenter on the base in Trinidad for a while. He traded in ground provision in Trinidad and Grenada. So, when the storm came and the boat was basically the provisions kind of rotted. And so there are times when we were very poor. But I would say that we live comfortably now, my siblings and I.
Okay. But what are some of the treasured memories for you as a child, probably growing up in St. Vincent and the Grenadines?
Well,
What you can recall?
I have no treasured memory concerning my Indian heritage. And really, St. Vincent is a dim memory for me. I've been back and forth over the last few years. St. Vincent has changed quite a bit. Everybody now has a big house. I mean, I was amazed at how many big houses there are in St. Vincent when I went back a few years ago, and it's progressed. St. Vincent has progressed a lot. And I think the present prime minister did a lot in terms of education. For instance, a number of my family got scholarship to Jamaica, to Taiwan, that kind of thing. So I think he has done very well for the people of St. Vincent. And you can see it as a quote unquote a former Vincentian going back. You can see the difference. There are so many cars on the road now that crossing the street in Georgetown, you take your life in your hands because there's so many vehicles going up and down.
Okay.
And I was just there a few days ago, as you know, and it's changed so much from when I was a child.
I'm sure you had some times growing up where it was not so good. You mind sharing a few of those if you can recall?
Well, we grew sugarcane, and when sugar went out, we would switch to bananas, but people were always stealing the bananas. It's by then my dad had gone to England, and the not so good times, let's see. We had family in Park Hill, in Bayaboo, and we shared with each other. So there was not really, we were never hungry, if that's what you're asking. There were always shared breadfruit and, ground provision. Fish was easily available and cheap. So we never were hungry as such.
If you had the opportunity to change anything in life, what would that be? And same so for St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
The only thing I would change in St. Vincent is the medical system. I think that St. Vincent is a paradise. It's not been too developed, and that is a good thing in today's world, where everything is so developed that you can't find any places where you can find trees and breadfruit growing on trees and mangoes everywhere. It just is a different island, except for the medical situation. My mom visited St. Vincent some time back and ended up in the hospital. She had to take her own toilet paper. There was no toilet seat on the toilets and that kind of thing. So I would change the medical system a little bit. Although it's improved, there is now a hospital in Georgetown staffed by, I think, Cubans. So the medical situation has improved, but it still can improve some more.
Okay. In terms of your life, you didn't mention if it is you were able to change certain things about your life, what those would be.
I've lived a pretty good life, my friend. I wouldn't change too much about my life.
All right.
When I was in St. Vincent, look, when I was in St. Vincent, I have 2 school leaving certificate because I was too young to leave school. They didn't know what to do with me. So I went to the student teaching program, where you went to college, first 3 days and 2 days in the classroom, then 3 days in the classroom and 2 days. And so I had it pretty good. There are many incidents in my life where I rebelled against the system and therefore was sent to teach in Turma, when the streets to Turma were really not roads, really. They were dirt roads with big potholes. And I rode a bicycle first, then I bought a Zundap, and then I bought a Triumph. I bought it from a guy who used to race it in Trinidad. So I was the first young person in St. Vincent to own a big motorbike, so to speak. And so my life has been pretty good. I wouldn't change anything.
Okay, can you tell me what you know, if you know, about the SVG Indian Heritage Foundation?
I do know about it. I've followed it over the years. It's a good way for people to connect, for people to share information. This information belongs to every one of us, our ancestors' information. And so I think it's a good idea.
Okay. And what would you like to see the foundation accomplish?
Well, I think that they need to reach out inclusively to all East Indians in St. Vincent and around the world. I mean, this is a huge diaspora. Most East Indians, except you and a few others, have left St. Vincent and gone to England and Canada and USA. When I go to High Wycombe, it's a Vincentian area in England, basically. And Brooklyn has lots of Vincentians. Florida, around Oviedo and around that kind of area, has lots of Vincentians. So basically, the East Indians in St. Vincent had to fight for everything they had, and they just decided to leave. Basically, there are very few East Indians left in St. Vincent, pure East Indians, that is. There are lots of people of East Indian heritage, meaning they have East Indians in their background somewhere. But the big families have left, basically.
Okay.
I mean, when I go to Mespo and Richland Park now, they're not Indian strongholds as they used to be. Calder still has a few, but I drove through Mespa the other day and I saw one East Indian on the street. That was it.
Okay.
Identifiable East Indian, that is.
Okay. Were you able to listen up to any of our previous interviews? We did about 16 or so, between 2020 and 2022.
I listened to maybe 5 of them. For us who are researchers, we want to hear stories about what their parents told them about Eastern, the way of life, and so on. Mm-hmm. Because in telling those kinds of stories, you get hints. And what I've learned from my research is not everything that your ancestors told you is accurate. For instance, my great-grandfather took the name Kilpa Singh. I know he was not a Singh, but he took it anyway because his wife was a Sikh. And so his wife tells the story, if I was in India, I would never have married him. He was just of a different religion, different caste than I was. the fact that he took Singh meant that he wanted to be like his wife, but he was never a Singh when he was born. His Aku was never a Singh, and his father was Aku, and he took Kilpa Singh. There are lots of other people in St. Vincent, like for instance, I've seen maybe 6 or 7 records of Rambalak, where he actually had to give his name legally. And he never said his name was Rambalak Singh. But I see that a lot on the Indian Heritage site, that he was Rambalak Singh. He took Singh probably after he was, or his descendants took Singh. More likely, his kids took Singh. Rambalak, his kids were Bullocks and Bacchus. Now, I've been researching lately how Indians got their names. And people tell me that they got their names from their godfathers, godparents. Not true in every case. In fact, what I find in the records doesn't verify that at all.
Okay.
For instance, let me tell you the story, since a lot of people on the Indian Heritage have Rambalak as their ancestor. Rambalak, he took the Ram off and slightly changed his name to Bullock. So when you look in his kids' names were Bullocks, and Bacchus was an Indian name. I mean, my Lachman's grandparent was Rambacchus. And so the name Bacchus is a derivation of the Indian name. And
Okay.
there are about 3 or 4 people on the ship's list called Rambacchus
Okay.
or Bacchus. And so that's how that name came about, as far as I can see from doing all the research that I've done.
Okay.
Lachman, as I told you, was Luchram. And I don't know where the name Bahaley came from, but it is an Indian name. And so they took the closest, or people actually spell the name differently.
Okay.
Because the people in St. Vincent, the estate people and so on, wanted Indians to stay working for them. So
Okay.
they changed their culture, they changed their names. If you want to change a person's culture, the first thing you do is change your names.
Okay.
And
Well,
so, go ahead.
yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Finish your point.
So what we find is the Anglican Church, who represented the planters in Georgetown area, Georgetown, Rabuka, Turuma, Orange Hill, Lot 14, was dominant. The Anglican Church was dominant. And when the Methodists came in, the Anglican Church tried to, anyone who was baptized by the Methodists, the Anglican Church tried to rebaptize them.
Okay.
And so if you look in the Anglican Church, you can't find many names, Indian names. They just list as the parent of the child, Cooley.
Okay.
So you have 2-1 in terms of the numbers of Indian names in the Anglican record.
Okay.
2 that says Cooley and 1 that actually gave the Indian name.
Okay.
Now in the Methodist Church, the Methodist record, they were called Wesleyan, I think. The Methodist Church, they actually list the Indian name and how they got their names sometimes. And so there is a name, Ramkisson. Ramkisson became Huggins. It's one of the Huggins, not
Yes,
all the Huggins
not
are
all.
the same line. But this one was in Argyle area, Richland Park, that area. And Ramkisson's took the name Huggins, Wilfred Huggins, based on a leader in the Methodist Church. And his wife took Mary Jane from one of the Sunday school teachers. And they weren't actually the people who were their godparents, because they didn't need godparents. He was 70 years old, his wife was 60 years old when they changed their names.
Okay.
And in the records, you will find a lot of people who changed their names at 40 and 50 and 60. So I think, I'm still trying to research this. I think, for instance, Aku's children were Moores, Phils, Baptiste, Sutherlands, and the daughters married, Setaram and Gangaram. Now, these people took different names. Setaram took Woods, Gangaram took King. So you had all these siblings taking different names. And my question is, why did they take different names? It wasn't that they all had different godparents, because when they were baptized, some of them were older. And they were all baptized together, many of them. So it's still a mystery why they took Phils and Baptiste and those kinds of names. Okay. Sutherland, there was a Sutherland in Orange Hill at the time that these guys took the English names, and he was a black footman. So basically, it's still a mystery.
Okay.
As to why they were taking different names.
Okay.
For instance, my mother's grandparents took Samuel, but the brother was Samuel, the sister was Laborde. Now, it's a mystery as to why they took their names. I could have asked my great-grandmother before she died, but unfortunately, I wasn't interested in those things back then. And so, but I'm still researching it.
Okay. I was going to ask you about the connections, as I have you, with my surname, because I was told that, at least by my father, was told by his father, that the original surname was somewhere along the line of Bihari or Bihari Singh. I'm not sure if the Singh was added, as you rightly mentioned, in some cases where the Singh was added after by other children.
Right.
But it was Bihari or Bihari Singh. Still not able to determine for sure.
Well, the Biharis came from Bihar, and they were Biharis, and so that became Bihari.
Okay.
When they came to the Caribbean, they were Biharis. They were regarded as Biharis, and so they became Bihari, and that's how the name Bihari came about.
And
they were from Bihar.
And apparently, the Anglican Church as well was also responsible for that change in the name. And hence, when they were anglicized, they took the name Harry, which was already quite prominent among those of African descent. Hence, today you don't have a lot of Harrys of Indian descent, most of African descent, because it's a small family of Harrys that directly of Indian descent, at least that I know of.
Well, you know that they came from Bihar.
Yes, that I was told.
So they were Biharis.
Okay.
That's how the English regarded them, as Biharis.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to share with us before we wrap up?
Well, here is the thing. When you I try to get three sources for my Indian names: the church records, the ship's records, and the traditions. And all of those could be wrong to a certain extent, because the English wrote the name the way that they were pronounced. And so you got variation in the names as you look through many records. But I would recommend that people look in church records for their ancestors. If they knew their ancestors were Anglican, They can look in the church records. There is a large database or books in the Anglican Church in Georgetown for the people who are Methodists, and most of the people around Argyle, Calder, Richland Park, the Methodist Church evangelized them. And so you will find at Montauk records of that. Now, I have not been in the Catholic records, but I know that there are Catholic records in Kingstown. And so if you had if your ancestors were baptized by the Catholics, you need to look in the Catholic records and then match those up to the ship's list. Now, on the ship's list, there are lots of missing pieces, meaning, for instance, the Countess of Ripon, where two of my ancestors came from India on the ship they came on. There are lots of missing pieces on that. All they have is the name and maybe the father's name, but no place where they came from. So I've tried to get the ship's list from India. And I spoke to the Indian representative in Suriname, not the present one, but the one before, who went back to India because his wife died. And he said there are ship's list in India. Now, my brother, who is married to an actual Indian from India, went with his wife because they have access to the archives in New Delhi. And they went and looked, but they couldn't find the ship's list. But their records in Calcutta, records in Bombay, and records in Delhi. And I haven't been to all those places. One of these, maybe somebody will sponsor me to go to these places.
Must be an expensive process as well.
Yes, I know. I went to India once and tried to get into the archives in New Delhi, and they told me I had to get a letter from my consulate before they would let me in. I don't know if they were looking for a bribe, but I was kind of scared to offer a bribe. And I said, which consulate? Because I'm a Canadian citizen, but I live in the United States. And I'm also a Vincentian citizen. They say, the one whose passport you're traveling on. I said, well, that's the Canadian government. And really, I don't live in Canada anymore. So, and so basically I had to leave the next day and I never got in. But you have to have some background to search these things, know what you're looking for. Because my brother, who doesn't have a background in this research, searched and couldn't find anything. But I know that there are records. And so somebody who has an opportunity should look into the ship's list. The actual, when the list that is in the archives in St. Vincent was made, a lot of information was missing. And in order to find that information, you have to go back to the original list in India. And during the Safra, a lot of the immigrants had papers. They were all destroyed. So we have no papers. In Trinidad, for instance, you can go and get your immigration. You have your immigration paper. So you have the names, the occupations, where they're from, and that kind of thing on your actual immigration paper. But all of that was destroyed in the Safra.
Okay.
For the people who lived up there, I don't know about Argyle, but nobody has been able to tell me that there is any such thing amongst the Vincentians. Okay. The Trinidadians have it, but the Vincentians don't. So we need the ship's list from India. The other thing is the archives. I've been to Kew in London about 3 times. So I've looked through almost all, but I just found out that there are some volumes in the British Library in London, in St. Pancras, that I haven't accessed. And that will have lots of information. So those who live in England can go and look in the British Library for those 7 volumes and look at them, see what information there is there about the Vincentian ancestry and
Okay.
Vincentian conditions. We have to share these things. Unless we share them, I mean, I'm going to give, when I'm done compiling my ancestry, I'm going to give it to all my relatives. Anyone who is on the list who wants it can get it, because this information belongs to everybody.
And we'll be happy to get a copy for the foundation as well.
Yeah, and when I first started to put stuff on the internet, I contacted some people who they said had information, but they refused to give it to me. So basically, if we're going to do this right, and I know that Len Roy wants to do it right and wants to share, but he needs to encourage the other people who have information to share.
In all of your research, though, I did hear, I'm not sure if this is true, that there is possibly an old Indian burial ground in Orange Hill, well, Lot 14 region, within that region where the eruptions took place in 1902 and decimated the populations there. Are you aware of any such?
No, I'm not aware of any particular place that where Indians were buried. In fact, I've looked every place for a list of the Indians who died in the Safari, because my mother's grandparents died. They had gone to they had a plot, where they grew vegetables, and my great grandfather had gone to sell up in Overland. And when the announcement of the Safari came, my great grandmother went to find him, and they found both of them just across the river in Rabuka, in each other's ashes, basically.
Wow.
She had found him, brought him, and when he came to the river, they couldn't cross. But the kids were all saved.
Okay.
So my grandmother, all her siblings, there are people like Samuel, in Park Hill, there are lots of Samuel. They're all related to me.
Okay. Well, we would have to wrap up at this point. I know we've shared quite a lot, well beyond the 20 minutes that we had planned.
Yeah.
But of course, it's all information that I'm sure that those who are viewing and those who are listening would certainly want to know about. So there's no harm in sharing that information.
Right.
But did you enjoy sharing it with us?
Yes, and if anyone has information that's passed down on how they got their names, I'll be interested, because that's my present project.
Okay, and how can they reach you to share that information?
They can reach me at rubailey@hotmail.com.
rubailey@hotmail.com. Okay, so they can send you an email with whatever family research that they have, so you can add to this list that you're compiling.
Right. Well, mostly I want to look at the change of names.
Okay.
That's my present interest, is how people got their names.
All right. Well, what we'll be doing, sorry, go ahead.
I think some of them got it from what is generally said, the godparents, but not all.
Okay. All right.
It's a much more detailed and sophisticated issue.
All right. Well, I'm glad you took the time out to speak to me. I know we had to do this another time and then we had to reschedule, but I'm glad that we were able to connect.